today, for being on this call. Happy Easter, everybody. I hope that your Sunday has been going good so far. And I know that times are really hard. Most of us are in quarantine or practicing safe social distancing, and I'm just so appreciative of everyone who's made this series possible, to all our speakers and to everybody who's participated throughout this series. I'd like to thank Ron for being on today. He's so knowledgeable and such a great presence. And so I'm very thankful that you were able to join us and take time out of your day to do this, Ron. And for everyone who's just now joining, looks like we have some people who are jumping on the call. Ron would like this to be as just have as much feedback as possible. He wants this to be an interactive talk, so please submit any questions via the Q&A function and not the chat function. Chat has been disabled for this talk, so thank you guys so much for being here. And with that being said, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to Ron to get started today. Thank you, Ron. I'll be here. I'm just gonna give the time over to you now.
This is Easter, as most of you know, and this is deliberately about what we call Bible-based groups that are based on some sort of initial Christian premises, but there are applications in other areas too. But we're not really talking about promoting or putting down mainstream Christian views in any way here. This is really cognitive behavioral therapy applied to our more or less fixed views that we hold about ourselves, about others, and about God that we no longer think are true, but we don't know what to think when we see certain passages in the Bible. Traditional principles of literary interpretation have been carefully used for centuries by Christian and Jewish theologians to understand and communicate what the written message meant to the original hearers and what that implies about how we might understand that message today. We'll look at a few concepts and from that some passages, but discussion is encouraged, especially to bring up difficult passages for you, difficult things for you, ideas that are hard to get out of your head after leaving the group. Remember, we're not concerned about arriving at beliefs as we are about understanding a legitimate interpretive process and contrasting it to that which we were exposed in the group. This not only applies to Bible-based groups, but also to cults based on other traditions where getting the interpretation of a passage correct is crucial to avoiding suffering and discouragement. Some of the topics that often seem to be what I call the greatest hits for cult leaders is capitalizing on what appears to be a message in the scriptures of a rather extreme view of women being subjected to men, wives submitting to husbands, women pictured as lesser beings than men. Number of problems with that view, but it's not difficult to see in a 2,000-year-old document that this was definitely in a male-dominated culture. So it is a product of its culture, but it's a product of many cultures written over about 1,600 years. But, so wives submitting to husbands, we're going to talk about that. We're talking about followers. Most groups submit all aspects of life to leaders and serve them as they would serve God. This is because God holds leaders responsible for the welfare of followers. So it makes logical sense that if I'm responsible for your welfare, you darn well better do what I say. Followers will be blessed by God for submission to leaders' authority, even if he or she is wrong. That makes it really easy to find the will of God for your life if you have someone to submit to. Otherwise, we might need to read the rest of the Bible, including Micah 6:8. So, calling attention to inappropriate behavior by leadership is rebellion. Discussing inappropriate behavior by leadership with another member is gossip. Sickness or any problems in life, especially financial, are due to thoughts or acts of rebellion. For instance, gossip against leadership. Therefore, leadership is not responsible for the welfare of those in rebellion to authority. And of course, leaders serve followers by leading. Are there any comments about this? Please feel free to message Axel and get some feedback here. Any of these things resonate with any of you? Am I scratching you where you itch? Are we on the right track here? Is everybody busy typing away here?
I would like to say that some of them was saying all of them. Someone said resonates certainly. Someone says, I am almost getting emotional about this. They said, I think you're on the right track. This really hits where I came from. So.
Yeah, that's where we're going. Well, to make it even worse, there is usually the teaching, whether it's overt or covert, the understanding that hell is an open manhole one can fall into at any time if one is not spiritual enough. But the problem with that is, how much is enough? Have you taken every thought captive? If you have a chronic illness, anxiety, or you're just not happy all the time, and you've already been prayed over for it, it is a sign you are not spiritual and you are living in the flesh, or you are not truly saved in the first place. Now, of course, if the same thing happens to leaders, it is because they have a thorn in the flesh given to them because someone in the group is harboring sin. Usually it's doubts about the anointing or even the sanity of the leader. If something goes wrong with the project the leader was led to start, it's because followers did not pray and bind Satan enough. If something goes wrong with the project a follower was led to start, it is because they were not in right relationship with God, as demonstrated by being in right relationship with the leader, which of course is determined by the leader. If a follower was directed by the leader to start a project and it goes wrong, it was because the follower did not follow instructions and did their own thing. Do these feel familiar? And feel free to put down just a few notes. Don't have to be long-winded. Just a couple of notes. Maybe even do some of your journaling for today. Just some things about that come to mind in these kinds of things. Any just trigger any thoughts?
Someone asked, and just kind of going along with participating here, they said, yes, you're on the right track. Is the Bible authoritarian or egalitarian? What is God's desire for his followers?
That's good.
Other people have been saying, if you don't get what you need, you haven't prayed enough, which is what they've heard.
That's right.
Someone said, this is more of a comment instead of a question. I assume you're familiar with the prosperity gospel or health and wealth gospel. This gospel is embraced by many and claims that God promises financial blessing and physical well-being. Millions of people follow this gospel. Thank you for that. You put that through. Someone said, I can't tell you how many times I've heard be anxious for nothing scripture. Someone said double standards are upside down from what the Bible teaches. Someone said, OMG, that not happy all the time one almost took me out. Someone said, yes, although I wasn't in a Bible-based group, people submitting to the leader was part of it.
Yeah.
Someone said, I've heard that from my wife's pastors. She keeps getting mad and moving to different churches. Yeah. Those are all the comments I had coming through. I think I hit every one of them, but great feedback, everybody.
Well, the question about is the Bible authoritarian or egalitarian is a very good question, and there are a couple of principles about understanding how professionals interpret the Bible, and really any other work of complex work of literature. And there are many themes and many messages in the Bible, but the primary theme that most scholars, when they approach the Bible and look at it from a literary criticism point of view, is that without a doubt the major theme is that there is a supreme being and that he cares very deeply and loves human beings. And one of the concepts that must be done when you are interpreting any particular passage, any statement in the Bible, is that everything has to be interpreted in light of the main theme of the Bible. You can't just go off and say the Bible says this when it violates the main theme of the scripture. You have to know what the theme of the Bible is. That's the context under which all of the interpretations need to fall. Now, it's written, again, during many different cultures, but most of them would be considered male-dominated and authoritarian cultures. They had kings, for crying out loud, and kings could command people to be killed. God himself is referred to as a king. Of course, this was a message to the culture that, yes, in spite of all that's happening, there is a God who cares for you and who is in charge, but is also wise and just. And so what the message of the Bible, and it's part of it that is quite revolutionary for every culture that it was in, is that although it acknowledges the authoritarian views that people had of leadership and government, the message, almost a subversive message in it, is egalitarianism, that's summed up by the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 5, a passage often misinterpreted to believe that he is teaching that that wives should submit to husbands and that servants should submit to their bosses and so it's a passage that appears to support authoritarianism. However, the thing that you have to look at when you're looking at that passage is the context in which it is presented. And the context was that because the statement that is the most controversial in there, of course, is wives submit to your husbands, and that sort of starts this progression. The passage, however, starts with, therefore, because of all of the things that had gone on before that, submit yourselves one to another out of reverence for Christ. And what is actually the message there is a very clear egalitarian message given in a culture that was not prepared 100% to receive it. But it also points out the sheer logic of it. Submit yourselves one to another. And you can imagine these good, because of course every the original Christians were, of course, were primarily Jews, people who were married to Jews, or fellow travelers, people who were not ethnically Jewish, but believed in the God of Israel. And all of them would have been steeped in this concept of, we're brothers. And and of course, in an early Christian meeting, it would have been probably most of them were much like a synagogue, and that the men stood in the front, and the women and children would be in the back. And of course, the statement is read as these letters were read in the churches, and submit yourselves one to another. Or all the men then, of course, look at each other and say, "Yeah, right. We're going to submit ourselves one to another." That's, we see that. We revere Christ, we follow Christ, and respect each other. Well, then the Apostle Paul starts meddling, because the first thing he says into this context is, "Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands," and actually says, "Do it intentionally, meaningfully, not just out of duty." And so the men are kind of suspicious about this, because he's just said, "Submit yourselves one to another." But see, the thing is, between those two statements was, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And the where things start getting really shaky here is now you've got submit yourselves one to another, husbands, love your wives. Well, one of the things that we do know about this time period was that romantic love was not necessarily the reason for a lot of marriages. The romantic love, often in the literature, of the day, often was about husbands and their mistresses, and that and so when it says, "Husbands, love your wives," that was not, not necessarily an automatic assumption at the time. But he was saying, "Love your wives." But then he says, "As Christ loved the church, giving himself up for them." Now, here you have someone who was steeped in a very, very authoritarian tradition, conservative, and probably not even completely aware of the revolutionary nature of his thinking. Because other places where you can't interpret Peter by Paul, you can't interpret different writers by other writings, but you can interpret Paul's writings by his other writings. And in another place, he talks about there is neither slave nor free, male or female, barbarian or Scythian. He just wipes out socioeconomic, racial, and gender differences, so that is part of his thinking. And anyone familiar with his writings would know that the traditional way of doing things in the culture of the day was under attack from the Apostle Paul. So he says this thing about husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Well, that meant husbands, step down from your culturally ordained position over your wife, as favored above your wife, and enter into mutual relationship with them. So it's actually taking an authoritarian stance, and as as God was authoritarian over us and came in human form, and then set aside his authoritarianism to become egalitarian, to become one of us. That's the same picture that husbands are supposed to have towards their wives. Well, he carries this even further in the passage, and he goes on and he says, it's only after husbands love your wives in this egalitarian way, very radically egalitarian way, that then wives submit to your husbands. That's the context of wives submitting, is husbands stepping down from the position of domination. The wives then the next one is he addresses servants, which we would call slaves. In many cases, these were slaves. They were owned. And the Bible is criticized for condoning slavery, but it's interesting in this passage is that it recognizes slavery, which is a terrible institution. It recognizes its existence, but Paul's language completely undermines the whole nature of it by saying he says to servants to obey your masters with the whole heart, but then he says to masters, or employers today, we would say, treat your servants with kindness because you serve the same master as they. So once again, recognizing the authoritarian view of the day, but at the same time then introducing the fact that, hey, both of you are under the same authority, and that authority is up here, way above both of you. This is not about you being over them. Okay. So it laid the groundwork for the modern concept of employer, and this is again a radical departure and a very careful presentation of egalitarianism into a culture that had really not looked at things this way before. I know that's a different interpretation than most of you have probably heard from cult leaders, but that actually follows how standard interpretive techniques work. It's called inductive Bible study method.
You said that's called inductive Bible
Yeah.
study? Okay.
Yeah.
Just want to repeat that for people.
Yeah.
We had some more comments come through. Someone said, a big one in ours was, you are supposed to sacrifice your life for Christ, but this usually means you have no life and serve the church.
That's right. Yeah.
Someone said, if terrible things happen to you, then you are sinning, and instead of helping you, the church distances themselves like Job.
Yeah.
Someone said, the Bible was written by humans when 99% of people at the time couldn't read or write, and it was recorded 200 years after the birth of Jesus according to Christian faith. Why can't we just believe without going through religion? I see religion as control from the beginning of faith till today.
Good comment.
Someone said, I really struggle with the supreme being as referred to as him. Isn't it both male and female?
That's exactly right. The Bible itself affirms that.
Someone actually recommended a book. It was written by a guy who was a preacher and told abused women to go back to their husbands and make up. Then he realized the error of his ways, and he teams up with an abuse expert and writes the book. It's called A Cry for Justice: How the Evil of Domestic Abuse Hides in Your Church by Jeff Kriplin and Anna Wood. And I'll actually put this in the comments for you guys so that you can get that full title and reference. Great comment. Thank you.
That is good.
Someone said, I can't tell if you're coming from a Christian or academic perspective. Are you suggesting that the Bible is the inspired word of God and that it is misused by cult leaders?
Good question.
Let's see.
Well, we're talking about it's a good question about, is the Bible the inspired word of God? There are a lot of problems that, it's almost real academicians have a real problem, regardless of their faith, what they believe, about supernatural being. But the seminary that I went to had an interesting faith statement in that they could not get the level of academic excellence in their faculty by requiring them to say the Bible is word for word called the plenary inspiration of the scriptures. And the reason for that is that you have to understand, it's the message. And so the way that it actually read was as intended by the original authors and as understood by the original hearers is inspired. And and that is a crucial point, because it does not allow us to blindly follow a plain reading without looking at the context and sifting out, what the real message is. And because we have to look at the specific place where this was written, who it was written to, because just as the person pointed out, it was written by people. And I can tell you, I found that out to be very true, because you do not want to, in Greek class, you do not want to translate the writings of the Apostle Paul, because he was an academician. He had a state-of-the-art Greek education, and he had a state-of-the-art seminary education by the School of Gamaliel, rabbinical school. And his language is incredibly precise and complex. Now, you want to go for Peter. Peter's a fisherman, and it's very obvious. His grammar is very simple, and his vocabulary is relatively small. So, beginning seminary students have a much easier time with Peter than they do with Paul. But Paul is capable of saying things extremely precisely, far more precisely than they could be said in English, and that's why there's plenty of room for professional pastors. This is why the average mainstream denomination requires an extensive education in order to be called a pastor. Most cult leaders, however, are self-appointed and have just enough biblical knowledge to be dangerous. And very few actually have academic credentials. Some do, and but have to violate some of what they have learned. Now, as for myself, am I speaking academically, or yes, I do come from an academic perspective. I do believe, but I long ago got over the idea of a supreme being, but I realize that's difficult. One of the best books I could recommend for people who are leaving groups and are still interested in learning more about mainstream Christianity is written by a former president of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. He's now a pastor, I believe, in North Carolina. But he wrote a book called Christianity for People Who Aren't Christians. And I'm going to be doing a book review of that. But I think it's a very good primer for people who have been exposed to some of this toxic faith, toxic interpretations that we've been talking about here. And
I went ahead and put that book in the comments as well, so that people can reference it at a later time.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Someone said, I listened intently and appreciated the interpretation. We were taught the conventional, and it was actually my husband who taught me the way you have explained it. I think this was in regards to the, wives submitting to their husband. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that is not a mainstream view among, and it doesn't really matter the denomination. You're going to find the same interpretations in a Catholic seminary, or the Baptist or anything else. As a matter of fact, many years ago, there was a ad in Christianity Today, and the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, signed this document along with a lot of other evangelical leaders that said, we believe it's that women's place is in the home and submitted to husbands and hierarchy in the home and all this sort of thing. And the Southern Baptist Convention almost had a walkout. The seminary that I went to was in a consortium with a Catholic seminary, Baptist seminary, and an Episcopal seminary, and several other seminaries. And the Baptist seminary, almost to a faculty person, was saying, no, that isn't where we can come from. We can't support that. And that had been, you heard that a lot from the pulpit and still do in a lot of Southern Baptist churches, but that's not really what's being taught in the seminaries, because that's not really a clear message of what the scripture says that as it is applied to today. It's interesting, God's desire for his followers, it's a rather simple statement, and it's right at the end of the Old Testament, and it says, what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. You can't get away from that. And everything that we feel, quote unquote, led to do or are told to do by leadership has to be run through that filter. Because if what I'm doing doesn't fulfill those three requirements, I'm not in the will of God. The prosperity gospel is it's perversion of what is a very, very positive message that the Bible has. I mean, let's face it. It's I've read the end of the book. We win. This is a very positive worldview. It acknowledges the difficulties and the horror, of things like we're experiencing right now with the pandemic. But at the same point, it is extremely upbeat. However, the prosperity gospel twists things to where because the Bible often, when it speaks, it's not taught. It's given to cultures that were not as individualistic as ours. They're given to cultures that were more communal. That it was more about the community than it was about the individual. And so, as an individual, actually through history, you can see that you do see cultures, and especially in the modern missionary movement for the last 200, 250 years or so, research has been done to show that communities where the gospel has gone, they do usually see an increase in socioeconomic status somewhat. There's also an improvement in the overall health. Well, a lot of that is because people are now becoming aware. They're intentional. They begin to learn basic sanitation methods. you know, so it's a, you know, there are just certain good things that happen because people are doing good things. One of the things that people keep in mind is that they talk about the prosperity gospel being like, you know, how that God magically took care of Israel. And Israel is a nation that lies just between the Middle East and Africa, and between two great water systems, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the Nile Valley. The Jordan River is a, you know, is a stream compared to these river systems. So, in thousands of years ago, Israel would not have been a terribly prosperous country, but it was located between two superpowers that depended totally on their river systems. And their river systems depended totally on completely different weather systems. The weather systems that controlled the flow of the Nile originated in Central Africa, quite a ways away from the European systems that blew over into you know, into the Middle East, and you know, and created the Tigris and Euphrates water flow. So consequently, if weather conditions changed, you know, for the Egyptians, because the Nile was low, they were forced to buy grain from the Mesopotamians or the Babylonians. They had no choice. They hated them. They didn't trust them. And they would do all that they could to not deal with them. But there were times where they were forced to. The reverse was true about the Babylonians. When the Tigris and Euphrates weren't productive, you know, wasn't enough water flow, they had to trust the Egyptians, because generally the Egyptians would have grain because they're dependent on a river whose source was different. Now, right in the middle, you have between these two superpowers who are bound and determined to swindle each other, you have the Jews. And the Jews happen to believe in a God who sees them after they leave the temple where the idol is. This is something that's very important to remember about Judaism, is that, you know, the Jewish God is invisible, but you have to understand the gods of the day were literally clay and metal sculptures, that item was God. Once you walked out of Sargon's temple, Sargon couldn't see you anymore. He couldn't tell what you were doing. And so, you know, you know, there was a totally different attitude interpersonally, but now you have this people in the middle who know their God is a just God and sees everything that they do. So consequently, if they're, you know, if they're going to, they're right in the middle. If you're you don't have to deal, if you're Egyptian, now you don't have to deal with somebody who wants to swindle you. Now you can, I'm making a long point here, but bear with me. Now you don't have to deal with somebody who wants to swindle you. You can deal with people. You don't believe in what they believe, but you know they believe they have to be fair, even to strangers. So who are you going to deal with? You're going to deal directly with the Babylonians who want to cheat you, or are you going to give a cut to the Jews so that you won't be swindled? You will get an accurate measure. Yeah. Both sides ended up having to do that. So they were prosperous because they were honest. The reason they were honest was because of their beliefs. See, the problem with the prosperity gospel is it wants to make it into magic. You know, and you know, it's like we talked, you know, we had a saying in the group that I was in, as the group was coming apart, we would say, you know, this we call this the kingdom of God, but it's really the magic kingdom. And you know, and the kingdom of God is not the magic kingdom. There are things that happen that are pretty amazing, but a lot of it has to do because of the things we do, the behaviors we engage in because of what we believe. So again, no positive message of the prosperity gospel. the problem is, is trying to make it into something magic that's an indication of something unconscious, something I'm not aware of that I'm not doing. Go ahead, Ashley.
And thank you for backtracking and answering that question. I'm sorry if I went over it too quickly. I just wanted to read some comments that have come through. Someone said, I've never heard the egalitarian interpretation before. It feels somewhat relieving, but I will say it is so hard to know what interpretations to believe after going through the experience of believing firmly what the cult taught.
Very good question. And it
Yeah.
does take a long time. I mean, I squeezed a 2.5-year seminary education into 6. So people ask me, did I have exit counseling when I left my group? And the answer is yes, I did. It took 25 PhDs and 6 years, but it was a successful exit.
Yeah.
It took a long time to, for me to understand the difference, to begin to see how far away from the mainstream and how irrational many of the concepts were. I remember the book that I wrote, the Damaged Disciples. I went through and did a lot of this work and looked at these passages but then I was able to run them by my professors, and they saw my statements about what our leaders said, because I had it all written down in my notes that I had taken, and also in their articles in the magazine that our group published. So it wasn't, there wasn't any dispute over what they actually said. But I would write down what they said about a passage, and then I would write down what the inductive Bible study method, approach would come up with. And several of my professors would look at that passage and they'd go, fuzzy thinking. So that's what's wrong with the church today, is fuzzy thinking. And these, people who've given their lives academically to this whole pursuit, and recognizing that when, it drove home the point that when you don't do this homework, you hurt people. Bad ideas. One of the professors we had, was in the most hated class, which is also, I think, the most important class, was called Philosophy of Religion. And he started out the class saying, in this class, which is a required class, you're going to learn the difference between a good idea and a bad idea. And he said, the reason for that is that bad ideas hurt people. Bad ideas kill people. It kind of drove the point home the first day of class. He didn't just cover the syllabus. He was clear what he's about. And he was right. And that's exactly where these ideas come from that hurt us so deeply. Is from the work of gifted amateurs. And often it's people who realize that if I just twist the meaning of a passage just a little bit, I can make people listen to me, and people will begin to follow me and give me money and to get me a nice life. And I can feel like I'm really doing good.
Someone said, just as a comment to your talk, absolutely fantastic, Ron. Thank you so much. Thank you for that comment.
Checks in the mail. Thank you.
Yeah. Someone said, I had a leader who said, my fear and distrust of leadership was a character issue and not trauma-based. Mm-hmm. That's really unfortunate.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Someone said sometimes people's education gets them from non-accredited schools. And my experience is kind of similar to that, where I came from a fundamentalist Christian background where the men, in order to kind of feed the churches in my background's network, they had to go to this one school, and it wasn't a seminary. It wasn't it wasn't anything like that. It was their own, system and interpretation, which was interesting. Someone said, and this is kind of a long comment, so let me know if you need me to repeat any of this, Ron. Someone said, I'm feeling like this is a Christian apologetics class. Did he really just call these words in Ephesians 5 progressive? Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives submit in everything to their husbands. Is he going to try to explain the God-sanctioned genocides of Midian and Amalek and the Canaanites as well? And then he said, this person said, Leviticus 27 says a female is worth less than a man. Exodus 21:21 says, one slave is his property, and the master isn't punished if he kills his slave, as long as the slave took a day or two to die. The Bible is full of the condoning of gender inequality, slavery, and genocide. How is this helpful to try to tell ex-members of Bible groups that these words were actually progressive and were inspired by a perfect moral God? And it's a very long question. So let me know if you need me to repeat any of that.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that has always been a curiosity for historians, both secular and spiritual, is that every place the gospel has gone, the status of women has gone up from the original culture, and you would think that it would stay the same or go down if the overall teaching of Christianity was one of putting down women and supporting these kinds of things. And there are a lot of statements like this in the Bible. There's an underlying concept which is very pivotal, and there is a statement that is often misinterpreted. It's in the King James Version, which is probably the best translation of the term, but it shows Adam was alone. God said he needs a partner, and I'm going to give him a help meet. The understanding is, the assumption of that is that a help meet would be someone who would be a subordinate, one who is less than. And that was a very common interpretation, and through the Hebrew religion and Judaism, Christianity, Bible-based, but the word helpmeet there is an interesting word. It's used in Psalm, where the psalmist is crying out and he said, God, come alongside me, and he used the term for God, an adjective about God that is the same word. So the Bible also refers to God as the helpmeet of the psalmist. So there's this mess. See, that's the thing about this dual message that has to be very carefully, teased out when you're trying to recover from a Bible-based group, is that obviously that word, we cannot continue to think of that term as being subordinate, because obviously the psalmist did not think God was his subordinate. But a helpmeet is someone who is helping, who is there. And it's the metaphor is that but if you have a hierarchical view, you can say, well, Adam was created first, and therefore he's more important than Eve. And of course, the feminist view is, of course, well, he didn't get it right the first time, so he had to, had to try again, and then he got it right. So, but these are valid points, and but you have to look at the overall the overall message, and and what you draw from the message. But I need to touch on the be anxious for nothing comment, because being a counselor, I run across this a lot with people who've been in cults, people who've been just going to mainstream churches, and it's a real problem if you've got the disease of generalized anxiety disorder, and you're hanging around with a bunch of Christians, because they're going to tend to see things on the lighter side. And as a matter of fact, a lot of my patients now that I see through telemedicine, very similar to this, now they're saying they're actually feeling very good. People that were anxious about anything, and they're actually feeling pretty good, because one of them actually just put it this way. They said, well, it's just really nice being around people who know what my day is. It's like, welcome to my world. And this whole business of separation and being afraid of keeping the body count, all that kind of stuff, this was going on in their head naturally. And and there are ways of managing that and managing thoughts, but in legitimate ways. But these are very real diseases. These are there's no such thing as mental illness. These are physical illnesses, and I treat physical illnesses, and I don't treat them with medication. It's kind of like the cardiologist who treats some things that a cardiologist does is done with medication, some is done with surgery, some it's done with diet and exercise. Well, I'm the diet and exercise person when it comes to anxiety and depression. But the question is, what then if you're and this is a problem with the way the prosperity gospel is used to control, and that is, the Bible does say, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, make your request known to God, and so on and so forth. And that's all well and good. And it does follow that a cognitive behavioral intervention is to recognize that what am I being anxious about, all these sorts of things. What do I have to be anxious for in general? But in general doesn't solve the fact that I feel anxious now. And and part of it is the fact that we if we feel anxiety, and the Bible says be anxious for nothing, we feel, or in a cult, it's a very easy target to be able to say, well, if you're feeling anxious, it's because there's something morally wrong with you. And that's where you run into problems. You're trying to, you're trying to make this into magic. Now, the things that the people 2,000 years ago were anxious about, things that especially, or things that are specifically addressed, if by mainstream Christianity, if you're interested in pursuing that, there really isn't much reason to be anxious, because, as I said before, we win. This is a no-lose situation. The anxiety that I run into a lot in working with ex-members, especially ex-members of Bible-based groups, is because they have been indoctrinated with this whole thing that if I'm feeling any anxiety at all, it is because I am separated from God irreparably, and I probably am not saved, which makes them even more anxious. And that's where the prosperity gospel really is used as control, and it's not it's not helpful, and far from being helpful. It's mentally unhealthy. Positivity, yes, we do need to see what we can see as positive, and and believe it. But again, keep in mind, when you have these disorders, you can intellectually understand things and even to some extent feel them, but it doesn't feel quite right. But that's not a spiritual problem, that's a chemical problem. And you can manage the chemical problem over time. There's nothing, in other words, you're not broken. You're not spiritually damaged. You're not, rejected by God. And that's the thing that we have to be very careful about.
So we have some more comments that have come in. And I do want to say too, ICSA is open to diverse perspectives when it comes to highlighting talks. And so I encourage all kinds of comments and inputs for Ron. Someone commented, I agree with the previous comment. They said, I'm not happy with the religious attitude of the speaker. Is there anything you'd like to say to that, Ron, or respond?
Well, I certainly don't mean to offend anyone, and this is really not the purpose of this is not to promote or to put down any particular version of mainstream Christianity, but we do have to, what I'm talking about is from an academic perspective is understanding that because what we're talking about here is undoing the damage that was done by faulty interpretations of the Bible, and which resulted in unhealthy views of ourselves, of others, and and the world, and it undermines our place in the world, our feeling of fitting in, and trying to recover from this. So I certainly don't apologize for coming from a religious perspective. I can't come from any other, but I certainly respect the where other people are coming from, and whatever you have done and what is helpful for you to to recover from, if you've been in a Bible-based group. I myself didn't go to church for many years. I'm not here to tell people, oh yeah, you just need to get saved and get back in line. Oh, that wasn't my story, and and I certainly am not an advocate of jumping back into some especially extreme expression of Christianity, even if it's more mainstream. Because I've met a lot of people and worked with a lot of people who left a very, very destructive cult and got into a kinder, gentler way of ruining their lives, through a less destructive cult. And we're very vulnerable when leaving groups like this, and it's very helpful to stick with your doubts. You don't want to let them control you and keep you from a search for truth, if that's what you want to do. But
and I think it's good to ask too, for those who may be disagreeing with you, what has been helpful in your recovery. I'd love to hear, and I'm sure Ron would as well, what's been comfortable and helpful to you with your recovery process through this. So please keep the comments going. This is great. Someone said, just going back to your original, I'm sorry, we're jumping around a little bit, I'm just kind of reading them as I come in. They said, I don't believe helpmeet means subordinate, but an equal partner. I think they were just in agreement of what you were saying. Someone said the Hebrew word for help usually refers to God. Just going back to what you were saying as well. Someone said he's disinforming the audience. And that's, if you're welcome to elaborate on that, whoever made that comment. Yeah, please do. Someone said, so many of these controlling concepts that the Bible supposedly justifies were drilled into my head too, just with a non-biblical explanation, but have found the YouTube channel Finding Freedom helpful and interesting. The guy is a pastor and Bible historian who works with addicts. After every talk on recovery, he interprets pieces of the Bible in a historical context similar to what you were explaining. And again, it looks like that YouTube channel is called Finding Freedom. That's been really helpful for this person during their recovery process.
Good.
Someone asked, Ashlyn, in my view, mainstream Christianity is also a cult. Could you say a little about ICSA's stance about mainstream religion? So ICSA, and this is a great comment, and I think it's really important to bring up, ICSA's view is, there's not a set list of this is a cult, this is, we don't have a list of all of these groups are cults. Instead, ICSA seeks to educate and really look for harmful behaviors in all groups. There's a lot of talk about groups being on a spectrum of control. And Ron, you've worked with, you've been around ICSA for a long time, much longer than I have, and you were also involved at Wellspring, I'm assuming as well. And is there any additional comment that you would like to make to that? About just the spectrum and diversity, and we more so look for harmful behaviors, and really within that context, like things to look out for within a controlling situation, instead of having this group's a cult, this group's a cult, this group's a cult.
Yeah, it's the word cult is really more useful as a swear word. And I say that, and because a lot of times there's something that happens after you have left a controlling situation, and it's not that you are looking at a set of beliefs that you don't agree with, but you've actually had an experience that that harms you psychologically. We ran across this at Wellspring, because we treated people from Bible-based, every business cults, every different perspective, and and there was something that happened when the person was able, after a while, to begin to look themselves in the mirror, or to look at someone else in the eyes and say, I was in a cult. I'm going to use the word, I was in a cult. And again, we're not talking about meaning here. We're talking about an emotionally charged and a way of acknowledging a truth, a fact. I was not in a dynamic business development model. I was not in a way of achieving enlightenment. I was not in a way of getting closer to God and serving my fellow man better. I was in a cult. Again, that's not an academic conclusion. And that's something that ICSA has carefully chosen to stay away from. I find value in the word in being able to call an experience something other than what I thought it was. And I was deceived into believing I was doing something very extraordinary. And all I was doing was allowing a megalomaniac to control me, thinking that I had this higher purpose in life. And from that standpoint, that's the value I see in the word cult. But it's not about calling other, particular groups cults from an academic perspective. But It's a little different view, but that make any sense?
And for those, and I'd like to say, just with this differing of perspectives, for those who'd like to present other perspectives, ICSA offers many forums. You could submit an article, you could speak at an event, and you may be coming from, or a future webinar, and you may be coming from a completely different perspective where Ron may come from, and that's okay. Someone said, I appreciate the attitude and comments of the speaker because some of us are still struggling with how Christian scripture is interpreted and how it was used to control us. Thank you for that comment.
That's really what we're talking about today. This isn't an argument to support Christianity. It's a way of understanding how I, as a follower of a cult leader, how I came to believe what I believe. If the process by which I came to believe whatever it is I believe was fraudulent in some way, manipulative, and short-circuited my choosing abilities, then I have to question everything about, not necessarily everything, but most of what it is I believe. And that applies to everything I've been talking about. And there's several people have made comments are wisely doing that. Question everything. If you have found that you have come by some of your beliefs in a way that seems like it was fraudulent, it's time to question those beliefs. We had a saying in Wellspring that people were talking about, they started out saying, well, I don't, because everyone who is in a group finds some benefit, doesn't matter how terrible the group is. And, but people would say, they start out by saying that I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And of course, we firmly agree with that. But it's interesting that at the end of 2 weeks, people would often say, I found out that yes, there was some baby there, but there was a lot more bathwater than I thought.
Thank you for addressing that. Someone said this breakout is very needed for those who are struggling with scriptures from the Bible. Thank you for that comment. Someone said it's also important to understand that as cult specialists, we don't hate other beliefs because we're cult specialists. Someone else said, I have found Ron's perspective incredibly helpful and balanced. I really appreciate him addressing many of these unspoken issues. Okay, so we got more background on the disinformation comment. Let's see. Disinformation about regarding anxiety and depression. It seems they're disagreeing with what you were saying about anxiety and depression when you were talking about that. Let's see, we have some more comments coming in. Did you want to address that at all though before I kept going through these?
That's an area that is open to ongoing inquiry, scientific inquiry, and there are huge holes in our knowledge about where these actually come from. So,
yeah, someone also commented, what we've learned from 40 years of cult recovery is that there is not just one way to recover.
That's
for that
exactly
reason,
right.
We have a variety of ideas. Some I may personally agree with or not. Let's see. Someone said, personally, I left a cult almost 15 years ago, and I still can't stomach any form of religion. Organized religion of all shades feels like a range of a tiny bit of poison to full-blown toxicity. I'm confused by people who leave one cult to join another slightly less toxic version, like any mainstream religion. It's a really good comment.
Mm-hmm.
Someone asked a question: how would Ron suggest talking to family members who remain in a Bible-based cult and are being misled, deceived? How do I talk to them?
Well, having been in a group that did not restrict contact with family members, I had a great deal of contact with my family who had concerns about the group I was involved in, and I found that their best efforts really didn't really have much impact. The thing that had the most impact was that they did not reject me, or they didn't act in fear that because I was in this group that somehow it would be harmful to the rest of the family. And so the fact that I was accepted and without being put down was probably the most effective thing they could have done for me. Now, again, if if they ask questions about and they're obviously seeking, you might provide them with with your views or things like that. But we found very few people, in the hundreds of people we had come through Wellspring when I was there, very few people were just ordinary contact with non-professionals is not the thing that got them out of the group. As a matter of fact, a lot of times it wasn't even an exit counselor that got them out of the group. It was the fact that exit counselor planted some things to look for, that then they started looking in those places and they realized that the exit counselor was right. And but the vast majority that we saw at Wellspring came out of their own accord. And but again, that's not a representative sample necessarily of former members, but we do suspect that the vast majority of people leave groups like this because on their own for a variety of reasons. But which is why there's a variety of ways of recovery.
Mm-hmm. Someone said, I remember seeing Ron at the very first ICSA event I attended, their conference in Philadelphia in 1997. Mm-hmm. I had left a United Pentecostal church several years before. It was attending that conference that I started a website on spiritual abuse, so I very much appreciate what ICSA does to educate people about unhealthy groups. Yeah. It's a very kind comment. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Someone asked a question: what was your experience at Wellspring? In your experience at Wellspring, how did you address people who left groups like Jews for Jesus and struggled with returning to Judaism? Did you encourage them or try to direct them to less abusive forms of Christianity?
Well, what we ran into with Jews for Jesus is that it's kind of a mix of things. The vast majority of people who seem to be involved in it, that at least at that time, I can't say anything about it in the last 10, 15 years, but the vast majority of them were not, in fact, ethnic Jews who had converted to Christianity. They were Christians who got interested in the practices of Judaism and wanted to live their life as Christian Jews, which in working with a particular fellowship that had left Jews for Jesus, there were some people who were, who were from, Jewish heritage, and they realized they didn't really like the Goyim that much. It was frustrating, for them. So again, there's a lot of dynamics when you use the term Jews for Jesus, and there's also a lot of people that are extremely happy living their lives practicing the Jewish feasts and some of the ideas of Judaism. The problem, it seems, is is the same problem that Paul dealt with in Galatians, where that if you don't practice these things, you're not a true Christian. And Paul came down that on both feet. I mean, if you want to see the best, sort of counter-cult attack that in the Bible, it was, where he's addressing people who are. Now, here's a person. Ironically, here's a person who is the epitome of Judaism of his day, the best educated, most dedicated, a person who actually had set his life for a time, set out to systematically murder Christians, who is now arguing against people who are trying to get Christians to live as Jews and as the only way of being Christian. And so again, this is a very complex issue that has been going on for thousands of years. And it's again running into some groups of quote unquote Messianic Jews. It doesn't. There's not really the charismatic leader. There's not really the control. There's just a mutual interest in the practices and living the lifestyle. So I really can't comment a lot on on that in general. The key is that people need to make sure that what they're doing is freely chosen from among options. And after being in a group, one of the things that makes it hard, especially if the group is shall we say, not relatively benign, sort of semi-controlling, is that we when you live in a controlled environment for a long period of time, your faculties, there's 3 areas of the brain that make up your the biggest part of your choice system, and they basically go into sleep mode. They're not doing much because we're not really making unaided free choices as members of groups where much of life is determined by by the practices of the group, even if it's not directly by the leader. And so making an unaided free choice can be very challenging, and for if you've been in a group like this, and it really does help to be around other points of view. It can be very, very helpful.
Thank you for that. And that was a really good question. Whoever asked that. We have a few more questions left, and then I think we've gotten through pretty much everything today. And you guys have been so great with, asking these questions. It's been very interactive, which was Ron's hope as well. So thank you very much. Someone just said, thank you so much, Ron. Your insight is very much needed. I was in a 5-fold denomination, but raised in a Pentecostal-based church. I left organized religion 2 years ago and have decided to not return. Thank you for that comment. Someone said, what advice can you give to help ex-cult members to move on? Because I struggle with relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a whole webinar in its place. That's a whole series of webinars in that question. Because what you're asking is how can I trust anyone? How can I even trust myself? Most of us who got into groups like this, we thought we were it was our best thinking that got us into this. If our best thinking got us into this, what does that say about what else I'm capable of getting into? And so it's very difficult to trust people once you have been betrayed on this level. And because usually when we're talking about people in high demand groups, the reason people put up with this is because there is a high expectation that what I'm doing is vitally important for myself or for human beings in general. And there is a higher purpose in it. And then you find out that all that you had believed in, all that you had trusted in you were betrayed. That leaves a mark. And we don't seem to have a lot of really good equipment to deal with betrayal. We can deal with loss, but betrayal takes time, and it also takes persistence. There are a lot of good people out there. It can be difficult to find them sometimes, but there are good people out there. There are people who do care. There are people who are who they seem to be. And a lot of times they're in unusual places, so you wouldn't suspect. But one person put it. They said they met this person that wasn't nearly as exciting as the kind of people that they wanted to form relationships with, but they realized they were very, very steady and consistent, and and basically a good person. And they realized that the reason I'm having a hard time in this relationship is not because of all the other times I've had bad relationships. It's that this time I'm not being entertained. And this is a good person, and a quality person. And we in groups, we tend to gravitate towards what is exciting, and what is good is exciting. We look for intensity rather than intimacy, because intimacy is discouraged. Intimacy means honesty, connectedness, and those are things that break up cults. But the things that make cults work is intensity, and so that's what we've been programmed to do for years, and that is to look for the things that are intense. That's what feels right. But there's actually a whole different set of chemicals in the brain that have to do with intimacy or connectedness and meaning and purpose. And they don't feel nearly as intense and feel nearly as exciting as dopamine and the ones that are triggered when we're in groups and have extreme beliefs. But it also feeds our ability to feel that we fit in, and that our life has meaning, and that we have purpose in life. And those are the ones that get triggered when we stop looking for the intensity and start looking for connectedness and meaning in what we're doing. And trust has to come later, because once you've been in a group like this, anyone that wants to be in a relationship with you is going to have to earn your trust. And in the same token, you're going to have to give them a little bit of leeway and give them the benefit of the doubt sometimes. The reason we got into the group is we gave people the benefit of the doubt way too often. But in getting into relationships, it's there has to be a whole lot of understanding that it's on the other person. The other person is going to have to to show me much more than the average person that they are trustworthy. I hope that helps a little bit and encourages you that there's a way through this, but you're right to be concerned, but don't isolate.
Yeah, they said thanks, so I think you answered their question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
We are pretty much out of time, and we have several questions still that we haven't quite gotten to. So, what I'd love people to do is email me or email Ron your questions. I could either send them to Ron, you can email Ron. His email we actually put in the chat function. So please, jot down his email before we end the meeting today. And just as a conclusion, thank you guys For those who, disagree with Ron, that's okay.
That's great.
For those who found it helpful, that's great. Everyone has the opportunity to participate in ICSA from a diverse perspectives. If you want to write, if you want to speak, if you want to do a webinar, whatever you would like to be involved in and engaged with, let us know. We are very open, and I'd love to hear how what has helped you in your cult recovery. Not everything, there's not like one thing that helps everybody, and so I think it's really important to highlight that. So thank you for those who were engaged today. I just wanted to quickly let everyone know that, we're talking about an extended online multi-day event, which would allow much more time to interact with small live face-to-face sessions. So please email us ideas for suggestions for future events. We would really appreciate it. We're really trying to highlight a variety of perspectives and people who are involved. And as far as the schedule goes, tomorrow, Monday at noon Eastern Time, we have a live presentation on spiritual abuse, the Dallas conference that was postponed to September, and COVID-19 with Catherine Keller and Dr. Cindy Matthews. It should be excellent. On Tuesday, we have a live presentation with Q&A at noon on how the current crisis may be triggering spiritual abuse survivors, in what ways coercive control groups' involvement and COVID-19 are similar crises, and what common clinical treatment and self-management approaches exist for survivors who are currently experiencing PTSD symptoms as a result of all that's occurring. That's with Delicia Barner on Tuesday. And so all these excellent talks are coming on. There's one on Wednesday with Rod and Linda Marshall, Power, Threat, and Meaning in the Context of a Global Pandemic. So we're really trying to tailor these presentations to fit, what's going on in the world right now. How can we bring resources to you guys? How can we help those of you who may be struggling or looking for a time while we're at home to perhaps pursue more education on these topics? So I just wanted to thank everyone for participating today. I really appreciate you guys. For those of you whose questions I didn't get to, I very much so apologize. Please send them to mail@icsamail.com or Ron's email, which I listed in the comments. Someone asked about previous recordings and how soon this will be on the ICSA website. It is my goal to get all the videos up of previous recordings at the end of April. And I apologize for that window of time that you guys have to wait. I'm currently in an Airbnb situation in downtown Portland, and we're moving into our house on the 19th of April. And by the time we're in our house, I'll have good enough upload speed to actually get all the videos and recordings on the ICSA YouTube channel. So if you subscribe to the ICSA YouTube channel, you'll get a notification when new videos get put on the site. I hope to have all of them up by the end of April. So thank you guys for being so patient with me in my current situation. It is what it is, and especially during this time of COVID, I just appreciate everyone's patience and engagement with this event. So thank you, Ron, so much for coming on and participating today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And everyone, please be safe out there. Enjoy your Sunday, and take care, everybody. Thank you.